In something reminiscent of a suspense movie, a shooting in 1970 on a nearly inaccessible iceberg in the Arctic Ocean left a Navy research division desperately seeking answers. How do authorities deal with an alleged murder in one of the most remote places on the planet? The shocking murder on Fletcher's Ice Island deserves to be remembered. On its website, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution describes a surprising project of the Soviet Union in 1937. A scientific team was landed on an ice floe near the North Pole. A team of just 4 men drifted on the ice island for more than 2,600 kilometers over the course of 264 days. The institution explains that the crew regularly measured ocean depth, took bottom soil samples, measured water temperature, took water samples from different levels, and carried out meteorological observations. When the station drifted into the Greenland Sea, the men had to be evacuated, which included a degree of difficulty, but the scientific expedition made important discoveries, including that there was neither large land masses nor small islands in the vicinity of the North Pole, and that the opinion about lifelessness at the near pole region was disproved. The weather and magnetic observations were particularly valuable as they opened the possibility for routine air routes across the Arctic. The Soviet program using such drifting stations continued from 1937 to 1991 and included 88 polar crews. Woods Hole writes that the research program of the North Pole drifting stations is unequaled in the 20th century by duration, variety of observational material, importance of scientific discoveries, and number of resolved problems. Surprisingly, though, the institution notes that the Soviet post-war activities in the Arctic were unknown to the West until 1954. But the United States was also interested in research in the Arctic region for numerous reasons. Woods Hole explains that the U.S. began using B-29 aircraft to conduct reconnaissance observations in 1946. By 1951, the Air Force had identified several large ice islands floating near the North Pole and decided to establish a weather station on one of them to do geophysical research. Rear Admiral Carl Holmquist wrote in the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute in 1972 that the Air Force, with large air bases at Thule, Greenland, and Fairbanks, Alaska, had a vital interest in the Arctic environment. Scientific information was needed for such problems as search and rescue, survival, and the construction of emergency landing strips in the Arctic. The ice island on which the Air Force chose to establish a station was called T3. The science magazine EOS noted in 2019, the ice island stretched more than 77 square kilometers, an area larger than Manhattan, and its level surface made it ideal for landing aircraft. Holmquist writes that T3 appears to have broken off from Yelverton Bay on Ellesmere Island, probably sometime after 1935. The ice island, about 130 feet thick and covering a 5 by 10 mile area, consists of freshwater ice interspersed with layers of dirt and gravel, all formed over the last 3,000 years. On March 19, 1952, a team led by Colonel Joseph Fletcher, the deputy commander of the U.S. Air Force's 4th Weather Group, landed on T3 in a C-47 aircraft equipped with skis. Fletcher told Scientific American in 1954, "When we reached it, the pilots made 3 touchdown attempts before they were finally able to land our plane on the rough ice. As we slowly opened the door to leave the plane, a biting wind hit us in the face." While still designated T3, the island became commonly known as Fletcher's Ice Island. T3 turned out to be quite persistent. While many other temporary stations had to be abandoned, T3 carried on. It was occupied by the Air Force between 1952 and 1954, then occupied again in 1955, becoming what Holmquist calls the nucleus for an Arctic research program during the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58. At the same time, Holmquist writes that the U.S. Navy Office of Naval Research was conducting its own drifting ice station program, as it was convinced that it was essential for much-needed Arctic research. There was no other way to gather data on the Arctic Ocean environment except with great difficulty and expense. In 1960, T3 became grounded, and parts of the ice island broke off in a storm. The Air Force decided to abandon the T3 station in 1961. But the island broke free by the end of 1961, and in 1962 the ONR identified the island floating more than 100 miles north of its last location, and realized that most of the station was still intact, and they decided to occupy it again. The Air Force officially transferred the equipment to the Navy. The Anchorage Daily News wrote in 2023, "Transferred from the Air Force to the Navy, the mission remained the same, to learn more about the mysterious Arctic. At its peak, more than 40 scientists and engineers were stationed at Fletcher's Ice Island, engaged in a diverse range of biological, geophysical, and meteorological studies. Some of the data collected there is still used today, functionally irreplaceable given the myriad difficulties of research so far north. While the operation was conducted under the auspices of the Navy's Office of Naval Research, the station was usually occupied entirely by civilians. Geophysicist Carolyn Ruppel told EOS, "The men spent months and months on this island under extreme conditions, just to get the science." Conditions were, in fact, brutal. Fletcher said of the first station, "The T3 experiment has demonstrated that man can survive the killing cold and numbing winds of the desolate North Polar region, but only if he is supplied with the best of equipment." Holmquist describes the conditions. Violent storms, frequent fog, and persistent low overcast skies prevail in summer and winter. Winter temperatures are well below freezing and sometimes reach minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, the temperature occasionally goes above freezing, but a chilling wind will drive the equivalent temperature to much lower values. Winter is a time of consistent darkness, except for a few hours of dim twilight near noon. In summer months, there's virtually constant daylight. You might imagine that summer is more popular than winter, but that isn't the case. In summer, the ice becomes too soft to land aircraft, and supplies are dropped by parachute. This can make for a difficult situation. Holmquist writes that in 1963, a scientist on another floating station had become ill, and the only option to retrieve him was called the aerotriever. The device consists of a specially designed seat attached to a 500-foot line carried into the air by a small balloon. An aircraft fitted with a special yoke then snags the line so that the aircraft crew can attach it to a winch. That all sounds quite harrowing, especially for an already ailing scientist, but the scientist died before the rescue could be attempted. The situation emphasized the difficulty of contact with the floating ice stations. Holmquist writes it was not until 7 years later that another death was to occur on an Arctic ice station under entirely different and unexpected circumstances. In the summer of 1970, the station was manned by 19 men. Holmquist writes that the 19 men were employees of federal agencies, civilian institutions, and private companies under contract to the ONR, as well as Alaskan natives employed by the Naval Atmospheric Research Laboratory as support personnel. The station manager, Benny P. Lightsley of Louisville, Kentucky, was employed by the U.S. Weather Bureau and was the technician in charge of its T3 meteorological program. As station manager, his position was largely titular. There was not much to do on the island, Holmquist writes. Recreational activities are quite limited and generally confined to books, games, and movies. One activity that had become almost routine was the brewing of wine from raisins or other fruits. The Anchorage Daily News writes, on July 16, 1970, Mario Escamilla accused fellow scientist Donald Leavitt of stealing his homemade raisin wine, certainly a prized possession. The argument grew heated, and Escamilla left to retrieve a rifle. On his way back, he was stopped by station manager Benny Lightsey. Holmquist writes that what happened at that point is not entirely clear, but it is evident that a heated discussion took place. A bear rifle, guns are kept in the camp for protection against polar bears, head by Escamilla, was fired in some way, and Lightsey received a chest wound near the heart. The killing raised many difficult questions. The station had no doctor, although that would have made little difference in this case. As Holmquist notes, from the information relayed, it was apparent that the victim had expired from a wound so serious that even immediate professional medical aid would have been to no avail. The remoteness of the site was demonstrated by the fact that the station radio operator was unable to contact NARL and ended up having to put a general SOS out by ham radio. Holmquist writes, ONR was now faced with a few dilemmas. An official investigation had to be made, and Lightsey's body and the suspect had to be returned to the States. Yet the runway at T3 was unusable for fixed-wing aircraft and will remain so until late September or October. But perhaps more thorny, the Anchorage Daily News writes, is who should investigate. The death raised a fascinating and heretofore largely unexamined issue of jurisdiction. Though primarily staffed by Americans, the ice island spent most of its existence in international waters. In fact, the island was frequently closer to Canada than the United States, which led to some diplomatic friction. No one was sure whether to treat the ice island like a territory, a ship, or something new. The Sault Ste. Marie Canada Star wrote, Canada, in addition to claiming sovereignty over all the Arctic islands, has passed legislation asserting the right to jurisdictional control over water pollution up to 100 miles offshore in the Arctic. The case had significant implications, the paper reported. One specialist on the law of the sea was quoted as saying that the question is a can of worms we'd just as soon keep closed. Holmquist noted that the laws of the sea are clear for jurisdiction over ships, boats, rafts, and debris, but ice islands were none of those. Beyond the international issue was the narrow issue of the Navy's responsibility. The project operated under the Navy's Office of Naval Research, but neither the deceased nor the suspect was a Navy employee. The task of informing and assisting the next of kin was taken by the Environmental Science Services Administration, the predecessor to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which oversaw the Weather Bureau. And who would investigate? The FBI had no assets in remote areas. Holmquist writes that the best option was the Navy's Naval Investigation Service, which was in the pre-Jethro Gibbs era before it was called NCIS. But the best idea for actual jurisdiction of civilians on the high sea was the Coast Guard, so a guardsman would have to accompany the NIS team. And how to get there? Without being able to land, the team would have to parachute, and removing the suspect would require the aerotriever. But the equipment would take weeks to prepare, and the suspect might not be cooperative. Waiting until planes could land in winter offered its own risks, as the suspect might still be dangerous. The idea to use helicopters also offered problems, as the Ice Island at the time was 600 miles from the nearest U.S. airfield at Thule, Greenland, and no Navy helicopters had enough range to get that far. The Air Force had helicopters at Thule, which could reach the island using refueling from their C-130 tankers, but that was a search and rescue team, and it required a declaration of an emergency to divert them from their regular mission. Even that scenario offered danger, as the weather was notoriously dangerous in the Arctic summer. As a further problem, the suspect would have to be taken directly to the United States, as stopping for refueling in Canada might create another issue of jurisdiction. To make matters worse, the incident was already showing up in the press. The ONR put the pieces together in just over a week, officially requesting aid from the Air Force and declaring an emergency to do so. A team including 2 NIS investigators, an assistant U.S. attorney, a Coast Guard yeoman, and a replacement for Lightsey arrived in Thule on July 24th. There, an Air Force helicopter had to be modified to add the probe for in-air refueling. The group departed Thule on the 27th and stayed 3 days on Fletcher's Island for the investigation. They departed with Escamilla and Lightsey's remains for Thule on the 29th. They stayed the night there, as Denmark had no interest in a crime that hadn't occurred on their territory, and departed on the 30th directly for Dulles International Airport, where Escamilla was charged by the Department of Justice with the crime of second-degree murder on the high seas. The U.S. claimed jurisdiction under special maritime law. In the end, the jurisdictional issue wasn't finally settled. Canada specifically waived jurisdiction in just this case without prejudice towards further claims about jurisdiction over T3. The U.S. amended the criminal code to give federal jurisdiction in cases where crimes are committed by or against U.S. citizens in places where another nation has jurisdiction, but that has not been tested internationally. At trial, the defense argued that the rifle was defective and might have gone off by accident. The jury found that Escamilla was not guilty of second-degree murder, but instead guilty of involuntary manslaughter. But even that conviction was overturned on appeal, and in a second trial, the jury acquitted him, so that after all the effort for the investigation and all the questions of jurisdiction, a jury finally decided that no crime had been committed. The station on Fletcher's Ice Island was finally abandoned in 1974. The island was last visited in 1979 and last seen from the air in July of 1983. Since then, it's presumed to have left the Arctic ice pack and melted in the Atlantic Ocean. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.